that later. But I just wanted to check first to see, were there any topics that you would like to discuss today? Anything of interest to you? Maybe questions you've had or family or friends have had that you would like to know the answer to?
I wish Courtney was here because she'd have. I didn't see her for service.
Evolution's always a good one. I mean, to me, yeah.
Also, the age of the earth, you know, common question and common things that, will honestly runs through my mind sometimes is, okay, carbon dating says this, but biblically dating says this. And when you talk to Matt from Creation Truth, they're very finite on, no, this is as far back as it goes. Doesn't go beyond that. And, I have a scientific kind of background through school and, physiology and anatomy and all that science stuff. And I'm like, okay, where's the balance? How do you prove, how old is the earth? How old are things,
That's a wonderful question. Absolutely wonderful. We'll address that. We'll address that. Any others that we should put on the list to talk about?
Got it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, this is my first class here. This is,
Well, welcome.
thank you. This is not really pertaining to like the earth, but people on earth. I've always wondered, like, women that abort their fetus, with or without their knowledge, can that fetus be recreated and brought to life in another sense?
In another sense, as in another life.
Well, not really, another sense is not really how to put that, but, I mean, without their knowledge, just like, experimental, can it be switched over into an experimental project and be recreated?
Like biocell research, that type of thing.
Yes.
Good question.
Cloning,
Yeah, good question.
I've always kind of wondered that.
Good question. That could be a whole nother,
Yeah, that's just, it's not.
because that gets into ethics too,
Yeah.
Christian ethics. That's very interesting.
Sorry, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
One of the things that interests me anymore, especially when you hear that science proves this or science that, is the disregard for it. The deception is out there, so individuals that would say, it's a science. Well, okay, let's look at the science of this thing. Well, wait a minute, now it's not necessarily. I have a reading from an author here, and it might cover a little bit of what the young lady right there just pointed out, or along that line, but it's just a short note here, I'll read it real fast. Biochemists tell us at the moment of conception, there is a complete genetic package programmed for development into a mature adult. Nothing will be added except time and nutrition. Every stage of development, from fertilization to old age, is merely a maturing of what is entirely there at the start. So that's how God works. I think it was Jeremiah, he said, I knew you from your womb. But God has put everything there necessary. So life doesn't start at 6 weeks. Things might happen at 4 weeks. Things might develop. But from the minute of conception until the minute one dies, as the old saying goes, when we come out of our mother's womb, we need fed and wiped. If you live long enough, at the end, you'll need fed and wiped. And so it's just a whole process.
thanks for that reminder.
Yeah.
Well, just don't live long enough, you don't have to worry about it. But if you ever go into nursing homes, a lot of times you might want to hold your nose sometimes, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Because, and so, but I thought that was,
Yeah.
but that clear, science has proven over, again, this is from biochemists, can be proven, but then there are individuals that say, so the deception is in, so they're science until, wait a minute, science proves what they don't want to hear.
Right.
Okay, wait a minute, now we need to bring in other thought processes.
Yeah, they changed the narrative, so no real scientist would disagree with what you read, but they'll use terms like viability.
Right.
When is the child or the fetus
But that doesn't
viable,
necessarily-
or personhood?
Right.
When does a fetus or an embryo become a person? That's where the narrative changes. Jeff, did you?
Yeah, I think one thing that I guess kind of bothers me somewhat is that our attitude of, and I'm reading my own biases into this, but it seems like scientists, and it can not necessarily be that, it could be art and artists or whatever, that when great things are done, it's like they created it as opposed to being discovered. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like they want to take, as opposed to discovering God's creation and what is there, be it on a microscopic level or whatever, it's already there, but it's almost like we revere them to the point where almost like, oh, they just made this, you know, because it was there. And I think there's a certain reverence that's false. I'm not, I hope that, is that clear? I don't want to go on anymore because I'll go in circles. But, you know, there's an arrogance on our part that I think the early scientists would have, being a Christian, would have brought, you know, would have been amazing that what God had done and how this worked, you know. Whereas we think like, oh, I discovered this and this is how I'm the man. You know,
Yeah, they confuse.
I'm penicillin. You know.
And you can. They confuse origin science with operation science, and they want discovering how things work, and then they publish it. They want to be the first to publish in whatever science medical journal, and they forget that somebody already published a long time ago. You know, but and that goes back into her question, and a lot of we just
Think if I had been
steal
created
from God.
without the ability to be healed,
Yeah,
I still could be an amazing creation, you know, in what I can do, what I can think, and that. But like, just think if, you know, God had not made it where penicillin works this way. This is how, you know, this is the way I look at it. You know, that's all part of God's knowledge and His plan and His design, that penicillin would work this way, that a skin graft, you know, or heart, you know, even transplants or whatever, these things can work because they are part of God's plan.
Well, God created the mind that figured out penicillin
Yes.
works that way,
Mhm.
you know.
And it's that arrogance on our part.
And many of the old scientists who discovered these things and who set up a lot of the modern fields have given statements that one of the reasons they got into science was to glorify God. If the world is an accident, what makes you think it would be understandable? If it's random chance, why bother studying it? But if it is a thinking, logical, planning God who did this, then it can be understood. And a lot of these scientists, I've got a list here if anyone wants to know. A lot of the founding fathers of modern math and science. But why don't we start maybe with evolution and the age of the earth, and we can add some other things on as those things come up. Growing up, I didn't become, I was saved probably about the age of 11, but I just went to church, and that was about it. I didn't become really devoted to God until my early 20s. So when I was in college, I was a nominal Christian, but I didn't know much about my faith. And so I was what would be called a theistic evolutionist, which is preacher preached Genesis, Adam and Eve, so I believed it. Adam and Eve were real. And in school, I read about evolution, so I believed that. And I just thought, well, there's some marriage of the two things, right? God used evolution in His creation. That's what I thought. And I think that's what a lot of Christians believe. It's kind of a compromise position. Creation is real, evolution is real, and we won't worry about the details of how they fit together. But there are problems with that we need to talk about. And my faith in evolution was shaken not by my religion, but by science. And a lot of scientists wouldn't want me to share that, but it's the truth. I remember I was in a geology class at IU, and we were talking about how we date rocks, how we age rocks. And we'll talk more about this later, but I was given a piece of paper, because when you send a rock into the laboratory to have it dated, you don't send the rock by itself. There's paperwork that goes with it, the bureaucracy. And you have to answer all sorts of questions about the rock, its location, its makeup, before the lab will test it. And one of the questions was, how old is the rock? And I called my professor over and I said, well, I think you've given me the wrong sheet. We're trying to figure out how old the rock is. He said, well, no, that's the right sheet. You need to tell the lab how old the rock is before they can tell you how old the rock is. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said there's different types of tests they can do, and they're all based off of what's called radioisotope testing, and we can talk more about that later. But the point is, depending on the test, they can give radically different years. Some will return values on the same rock of a few 100,000 years, millions of years, or even billions of years. And so you need to tell them how old the rock is based off of evolution, and then they can give the right test to give the right answer. And I said to my professor, sir, that's circular logic, that's circular reasoning. And he looked at me and he walked away because he doesn't have an answer to that, because that's what it is. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The first thing I should probably mention is that we can't date rocks. They don't come with little tags that say how old they are. So when people talk about dating rocks, it's not actually what they're doing. The main way we do that is with fossils. And this is going to sound silly, but it's the truth. And you can ask evolutionists about this. I'm not trying to create a straw man here. This is actually what happens. If you have a rock with a fossil in it and you want to know how old that rock is, what you do is you go to this big volume that lists all sorts of different fossils. They're called index fossils. And you look up the fossil that you find in that rock. And the book says, based off of evolutionary theory, that this fossil is 300 million years old. And you say, well, the rock is therefore 300 million years old because it's got that fossil in it. So the rock had to have been formed at the same time that that organism lived. And you say, well, how old, or how do we know how old the rock is? Well, it had a 300 million year old fossil in it. How do we know that the fossil is 300 million years old? Well, it was found in a rock that was 300 million years old. And that is, again, circular reasoning. And that is what they do. Every now and then in the scientific literature, you'll find someone who makes reference to that. It's like, hey, kind of an uneasy laugh. This is kind of circular logic. And there's that understanding, but the entire house of cards is based off of that. There's no way of fixing it. You cannot do radioisotope testing on sedimentary rocks. It doesn't work. So when you mentioned, Daryl, you mentioned carbon-14. That's a type of dating. That's used on organic materials like wood. How you would date a rock is you would take something like, let's say, a piece of igneous rock. Mount St. Helens, for example, erupted in 1980, and when the lava cooled, it formed igneous rock. Well, you can take that and you can crush it up and you can send it to a lab, and what they'll do is they'll measure the amount of isotopes that it has. Uranium to lead is the most common one, which we won't get into too heavy detail here. But what happens is when you have a radioactive isotope like uranium, what that word radioactive means is that atom is unstable. It doesn't want to be uranium. Instead, it wants to be something that is more stable, like lead. And so it starts throwing off particles that we call radiation, and over time it changes through various steps from uranium down to lead. And we can measure those isotopes. That's what you're doing. When people talk about measuring the age of a rock, you're not measuring the age of the rock, you're measuring how many isotopes it has. That is scientific. I teach my students the math behind this. We do math problems on this. The problem is then you try and make inferences based off of that. And there are assumptions that are rarely talked about. How much uranium did you start with? How much lead did you start with? And it's usually assumed that there was no lead there to begin with. Is that a good assumption? How do you know? Were you there when the rock was formed? What about the decay rate? Is that constant? Was some of the uranium added or subtracted, leached out during the process? Was others added in? And the truth is, there's no way of knowing unless you were there when it was formed. So do you remember when I mentioned Mount St. Helens? So some creation scientists decided they were going to get a little feisty, and they were going to take a rock from Mount St. Helens, again erupted in 1980, and they were going to send it in to have it dated at a secular laboratory. And so they filled out the paperwork, and when the paperwork said, how old is it, they just put expect young. And it came back as several 100,000 years old. They tested rocks in Hawaii, formed a couple centuries ago, that came back 400 million years old. And so what we're discovering is that rocks whose ages we know, because there were people there, and we know how old those rocks are, when they are tested with radioisotope aging, they do not match. They're millions of years older than they should be. So my question is, if this method does not work, because again, it's not bad science, it's not bad math, it's bad, faulty assumptions underlying the process. My question is, if radioisotope dating does not work on the rocks whose ages we know, why would we trust it on rocks whose ages we don't know? Okay, and that's a problem. Evolution, again, we can talk about this a little bit. I don't want to talk too much. I don't like to do that. I like to have discussions. But there's one thing I really want to say. It's a pet peeve of mine. Maybe I should pause for a second. Are there questions first?
How old is the Earth then?
That's a good question. How would we know? If we can't trust radioisotope dating, again, not because the science or the math is bad, but because we know that the underlying assumptions are false, how could we know how old the Earth is? How do we know how old the rocks from Mount St. Helens are?
Yeah.
We were eyewitnesses, weren't we? If you were alive in 1980, you could say, well, I know because I was there, I saw it erupt.
Mm-hmm.
Well, who was there when the Earth was founded? Who would know? There was an eyewitness. Who was it?
Yeah.
And so God says, this is how old it is. And you can go through the chronologies in Genesis. It's roughly 6,000 years. There are a few places where we're not sure if there are gaps between generations, but even if there are, you're still in the neighborhood of about 6,000 years, is what we're looking at.
Jeff, was it you that I was talking to? You listen or follow Hugh Ross or Greg Koukl, one of them a lot?
Yeah.
Koukl. Is he older? I can't remember. Him and Hugh. Has anybody heard of Hugh Ross?
He's older.
He's Stand to Reason, right? Or is that Greg?
The Greg Koukl stuff I done is tactics.
Tactics, but his ministry is Stand to Reason. Is
Yeah,
that what it
Stand to
is?
Reason, yes.
And Hugh Ross's is Reasons to Believe, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Hugh is an old Earth, so he would disagree that it's the young Earth is 6,000 whatever. He would say it could be. He's okay if you say millions. He doesn't hold devolution, but he lays out a really convincing case. I don't know what I am personally. I always lean towards young, but there's a lot of all of you know that Norm Geisler was kind of. That's how God got a hold of me. Norm has switched like 5 times in his ministry. He went from old to new, new back to old back to new, to it doesn't matter, to back to old. And Hugh, actually, I think he died holding the Hugh's view, which was old. But most of the good Christian men that I know, that's not something that you want to break bread or like stop eating bread over, right? Whether it's old or whether it's new. I will tell you, for me personally, as you all know, my pet peeve is context. And when you write this down too, you can watch it on YouTube if you want, or you can buy the DVD. It's free on YouTube. It's called Is Genesis History? And I forget the guy's name. Anyway, it's he starts off talking about this, and they go in. He sees a bunch of Hebrew scholars, and they go in, and they have Hebrew manuscripts, and they're reading, and they talk about the ancient meaning of the word day, right? And
Right.
day can mean different time periods depending on the context. But in Genesis 1, the context is numerical, so it seems most likely that it's 6 literal 24-hour time periods or whatever, not day 1 and then there's 10,000 years and then there's day 2.
With day 1 being creating the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
So then how do we get at the speed of light going from galaxies far away, 20 billion year old light from a star?
That's a great question. So The secular view of the age of the universe is around there. It's about 14 billion years old. And one of the things I've been interested in is, if you haven't heard, there's a new telescope. Hubble was all the rage for a while.
Right.
Now it's the James Webb.
What, yeah.
James Webb telescope, much more powerful. And if you've been reading the articles over the last few months, there's been a wave of astonishment coming through because we're getting images of very early galaxies, which you have to understand how this works. Let's say you have a brother and they write you a letter, tell them how they're doing, and they say, well, I'm just having a fantastic day today. And you look at the envelope and it's postmarked 3 days ago. Now, what does that tell you about how they're feeling today? Nothing. You know how they were feeling 3 days ago.
Right.
That letter's like a little snapshot back in time. It tells you what they were like 3 days ago. You have no idea how they're doing today. Well, light takes time to travel. So under the secular model, if you see light that's 14 billion years old, you're not seeing the galaxy as it is today. We don't know. That could have exploded centuries ago. What you're seeing is how it used to look 14 billion years ago. Now, under secular cosmology, they believe that, like humans, galaxies evolved. They went through changes. So they would expect to see very young galaxies, fresh, newly created right out of the Big Bang galaxies. But you don't. The images we're getting are fully formed, old galaxies, and everyone's panicking. You read these articles, and one person said, nobody can explain this. And I'm thinking, I can. They're fully formed because they were created that way. Now, how do we explain that? There are a lot of different theories about this, and I don't pretend to be an expert. But one thing I can mention is that there was a fellow by the name of Albert Einstein, and everyone knows his E equals mc squared. What a lot of people don't know is that some of his theories, special and general relativity, say that time is not constant, which is hard for us to hear. We live our life where a minute is always a minute, and an hour is always an hour, and a year is a year. Einstein says that's not true, that it changes. Time moves more slowly or quicker based off of a couple of things. Gravity, how strong gravity is, and how fast you're moving relative to an observer.
Or how old you are.
There you go.
Yes, it does.
So under the secular model of the Big Bang, you have all of the matter of the universe. Every star, every planet, every atom is condensed into a single point, what's called a singularity. The gravitational effect of that would be enormous. And Einstein would predict, well, that's going to affect how time flows. So what I'm trying to say is, it is not just possible, but necessary for different ages to exist throughout the universe. You could have an Earth that is 6,000 years old and a universe that's 14 billion because time is moving differently in different places. That is consistent with Einstein's theories. So there's no contradictions there.
Yeah, I just read in the beginning, God, and if I encapsulate the heavens being all that, then it was just tough for me to justify the 6,000 years. If there is something 14 billion years, but you're saying that 14 billion years could actually be 6,000.
Yeah.
Depending on speed. Okay.
When it says, and there was day and there was night, and creation and all that, are you saying with the time, it's not necessarily a 24-hour period like we know it today?
It's a great question. So I was talking about the universe. If we look at the Earth itself, because gravity would be the same everywhere on the Earth, time would move the same, which is why you don't notice time moving faster or slower if you go to Europe or Australia. And again, I want to be a little careful here. You can have whatever opinion you want on this. We're all Christians. I have a very strong opinion on this, but people who disagree with me are still my brothers and sisters. The Hebrew word for day is Yom. You've heard Yom Kippur, it's the Day of Atonement. And when it is used with a numeral, as Zach mentioned, it is always a literal day. It is not an age. It is a fact that God created the earth in 6 days. That is clearly what Genesis is teaching. Evolution is not the first one to have tried to put extra centuries or millennia to the creation of the earth. It's been fought. Augustine fought that in his day. We're fighting it today. Regardless of what you think about that, there's a couple things I want to say, and then I'll shut up and give you some time to ask questions. A lot of well-meaning Christians, I think, want to adopt a compromise position because they're trying to bridge and reach atheists. And say, well, maybe we can find common ground if I try and embed evolution inside the Genesis account. But that's not possible for two reasons. The first and primary reason is that evolutionists don't believe in evolution because they think it makes sense. Evolutionists believe in evolution because their minds have been blinded by the God of this age. It's a spiritual problem.
Yes.
It's a spiritual problem. I'm generalizing. There are probably some out there, a few, who have intellectual issues. But most of the people that you're talking to, we need to have conversations with them about Jesus and make sure that their souls are in a good position before we start doing these other little detail things. But just to give you a little example, one of the things that's a problem with this is under evolutionary model, life has been on this earth for millions of years. Dinosaurs roaming the earth hundreds of million years ago. What happened to the dinosaurs?
Extinct.
Which means they did what?
They all died.
And you said, well, so what, Dan? Where does the Bible say death came from?
Sin.
Who sinned? The dinosaur sinned?
Well, the curse of Adam's sin brought on the world.
So how is there death before the Garden of Eden? That is a huge theological problem. Because if you say that we've got dinosaurs hundreds of millions of years ago that died before Adam, then God was wrong. God says that death is a result of sin in the Garden of Eden. If it's not, what does that imply about sin? What does it imply about death? What does that imply about why Jesus died for us on the cross? We could have said, well, come on down, Jesus. It turns out death wasn't really the problem. Death wasn't part of sin. There was death before human beings. And that's a problem for evolutionists. Okay? You're going to have to deal with that. That is one of the biggest issues if you're going to be an evolutionist, is what does that mean about death and sin if it existed before men did? All right. Questions?
Yeah, I've got a comment. Now, this is how I've tried to rationalize the situation myself. I don't have a final answer by any means. But everything we've been discussing almost here today is about the physical world and the physical creation. How can you describe, measure, or quantify your spirit? Romans 8:6. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the spirit is life and peace. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's laws. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Now, the physical world, as we've been discussing, we've learned, and I don't think the physical world, well, this is too general, changes that much, but our ability to understand it changes. We develop new tools for measuring smallness, greatness, the telescope talking about see beyond or whatever. And so we have new things to understand. That's the physical world. The spiritual world, Christ connected the spiritual world. Jesus Christ came to earth to connect the spiritual world with the physical world. And he couldn't communicate with us in any other way, but he worked some physical miracles. Was that really what he was after? The physical miracles that he performed is a testimony from his creator, God the Father, that he was real. And now the physical and the spiritual world exist together. So you can't separate them totally one from another. They exist together. But how do you put the line between the two? I can't tell you that. But my belief in Jesus Christ has shifted from the physical world as we've all been discussing when we first learned as we're young and coming on. But you gotta make that change, and you gotta have that understanding of the physical world, and that's what Jesus Christ and his Father God is about. I don't have the all in all answer, but there's things you gotta connect with as far as the physical world, but I think it should be mostly the spiritual world.
Well, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, and this is me summarizing what I think you're saying, that the Spirit of God is in you as a believer, and because of that, you have the spiritual discernment to interpret and understand and discover the physical. That's your lens at which you understand the physical. Is that some of what you're trying to say? Is if we're separated from Christ, and you're just, we're secular scientists, then we can come up with whatever we want to come up with to make it say what we want it to say, and that's our flesh. That's us playing God. But if you're attached to the Spirit, if the Spirit of God is inside of you, that is the lens in which science should be interpreted. Is that close to what you're?
But we put so much effort into trying to understand and connect the physical world with the spiritual world. And we need to do a whole lot more in understanding the spiritual world and maybe connecting it to the physical world. We're doing it backwards.
Yeah, I think there's, we were going out, like millions of years, billions of years, and all this and that. I think there's also, what's the purpose of knowing from the Christian point of view that Earth would be 6,000 years old? I mean, like, for us to know that, if it's 7 or if it's 3, does that mean that my God's false? Do you see what I'm saying? And we're trying to use things, I think, that to measure what God has done that aren't measurable, and they aren't significant to my faith, or in some respects, even the world around me. Does physics change if the world is 6,000 years old as opposed to 14 billion? Do you see the point of what I'm saying? And I think Christians can be just as guilty of trying to go the other way to get that date as a hammer to, make my, it's almost like a source of pride, that like where.
I agree with you. However,
Okay.
what is the title of the series we're in?
Yeah.
And we're not debating necessarily Christian on Christian.
Right.
We're just trying to have further understanding to engage people who aren't.
But this argument can be a side issue.
It
that
can be,
keeps us getting to
but
the-
certainly people use it. Well, how can God create in 6 days when we know the universe is 14 million?
Got it.
This is just, how do you keep that conversation from stalling and bring somebody one board across the bridge closer to the gospel?
But, I guess the point I'm wanting to make is it seems like we have to be careful as Christians of not going the other way. That like,
Sure.
we nail down the date and then, by George, we've got it, everything, is heresy, or how far we want to go with it. And when we don't know
Sure,
that specifically either. And it's not the point.
sure,
Does that make sense?
yeah.
But what does it mean when God said, I knew you before creation? Creation of what?
Is that rhetorical?
The physical world that we're so intense in qualifying, quantifying. So we're trying to prove God by our physical measurements.
I'll say something and then I'll get your question there. I think these are great points that are being made up, and we don't want to lose the sight of the gospel. I think we can all agree on that. We also need to recognize, I think, that the gospel's under attack, and that there's an enemy out there, and he will do anything he can to discredit that. So one of the reasons why we have apologetics, one of the big reasons, is because if I can't trust one verse in my Bible, think about that. If one verse is wrong, what does that mean?
You question every bit of it.
So the only way I can trust what the Bible says about Jesus and what he did for me is if I can trust all of it. So I would agree, Jeff, with you in your statement that this is not important in and of itself, but it is important is in the fact that it belongs to the entire Bible, and not just this. We see that Satan's attacking our moral issues today. There's all sorts of issues with family and home and sexuality and morals that he's pulling on and trying to get to say, well, if this is normal, then the Bible's wrong. And as soon as he can get that, any foot in the door, then that discredits what Jesus did for us on the cross. We have to keep the Bible true as a whole and defend all of it, not just the parts we like, not just the fun parts. Everything God says is true, or nothing that God says is true. And that is what we need to be careful of, in my opinion. What was your question?
I just had a statement, based upon what you said, that we're trying to get people that are struggling to understand, which, I just want to simply put that each person's spirituality is, held within dimensions of their own, understanding, and I think everyone, whether they believe it or not, is spiritual with God because of the simple fact we hold our conscience and our morals, we hold those and we go and pass every day. Well, if we didn't have those, which are pretty much based off of God's law, then how are we to say that we're not spiritual? So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
One thing in the Bible that always amazes me is issues we struggle with in the moral world, whether it's abortion, lesbians, gay, whatever. God addresses them in the Bible from the very beginning. He talks about it. And I mean, it's like, when I have people say, well, these issues, they weren't important. I mean, that's today's world, and the Bible addresses things in the old world. No, the Bible addresses these same issues, rape or whatever. He talks about it in the Old Testament from the very beginning. The same issues are still there. And you talked about, is a day 24 hours? Well, one place in the New Testament, it talks about a day to us, maybe 1,000 days to God, but our reference to time is 24 hours. So, I guess I'm naive in the fact I believe God, I believe everything in his Bible is true, so that's what I'm basing my faith on and my hope on, and I'm basing that when I come up with these subjects with people, that God will give me the discernment and the answers I need to talk to that person. Now, whether they ever believe, that's up to God to work on them. I just have to be able to talk to them about it.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the purposes of this class. Satan is going to attack anyone he can. And we have friends, we have children, we have grandchildren who are going to have questions. And we need to let them know it's okay to have those questions, that there are answers, that you don't have to just check your mind at the church door. There are real, satisfying answers that are available out there. And a lot of people don't know that, or are too ashamed to ask. And we want to get that message out there to come and talk.
Sam comes forward to that question that Sally was talking about just in his Romans 1 reading last week, when he was preaching on about, as Scripture said, because they they worship the creation rather than the Creator. God gave them over to abased minds where they do this, and men and women do this. So we see some of the answers on why humans behave, why they behave. God gives us the answer right there. One of the statements you made a while ago concerning the people is just that they follow the ruler of this world, Satan, which we know from Jesus' description is the great deceiver. And, but to summarize the thought process of what they're trying to do, again, God always has the answers. Just 3 verses here in Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing, and the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, and this is why they're doing it, verse 3, let us break their bonds to pieces and cast away their cords from us. The reason is to separate. So get rid of God. We don't want him. We don't want him in our classroom. We don't want him any place. And God speaks in Psalm 2 that this is what men will take counsel and get together and do.
People believe what they want to believe so they can do what they want to do.
Yes, they do. That's exactly right.
But what do we have to have for salvation?
Another rhetorical question?
Yeah.
Faith.
Again,
Define faith.
Well, Hebrews 11:1 says,
Without proof.
Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. If anybody else has NIV, ESV version, I think that translation is better than mine. But let me read verses 2 and 3. Okay, I'll read 1 again. Faith is the substance or the realization of things hoped for, the evidence of things seen, the confidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By what? What's the it? By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen are not made of the things which are visible. There's your connection to the physical or the spiritual.
Right.
can I ask an evolution question? I know so if I get into a conversation or debate of evolution versus creation, and one of the questions that I usually ask the person I'm speaking with, and this is really a question for you, Dan, this is 100% science and biology. Are there species on Earth today that the species that they evolved from still here? Like a shark, let's say, hey, it evolved from a goldfish. Well, there's a shark and there's a goldfish. I'm thinking, no, if humans evolved from apes, why are there still apes around? Wouldn't those apes have evolved also? Now, I just asked that question back to him, and frankly, I don't know the 100% answer. I can't think of any, species that a scientist says, okay, here's the species, and that's what it evolved from, and they're both around today. Why would we be unique in that? Is that one of the questions to get them thinking, internally. So I don't know if you know that answer, or if you can think of that answer, or if you're going to bring it up, but that's what comes to my mind when I have those conversations.
That's another great question. The answer is yes, there are species like that. There was a dinosaur fish that lived, it was around 40 million years ago, called the coelacanth, and it had been extinct for 40 million years until we found them still alive in the oceans today.
Mm-hmm.
And that was embarrassing because they were supposed to have been, lived all those millions of years ago.
But did something evolve from the coelacanth fish?
So
Is my question.
there is no evidence anywhere that any species has ever evolved from any other species. We have to be careful when we talk
Okay.
about evolution. There is what I would call adaptation. So a miniature poodle is a dog, and a Great Dane is a dog, and they're very different, but they're both dogs. A dog and a cat are different kinds, and there's no cross-species evolution. What evolutionists will do is they'll look at two and say, well, they're similar, so I believe that one came from the other. There's no evidence for that, but they look at two species that are similar and say, well, I believe one came from the other. Well, I can go to a museum, and I can go to a gallery of Van Goghs, and I can see two paintings that are very similar, And what's my conclusion? Did they evolve from the same piece of canvas, or did the same master artist create both of them? So it's creationists and evolutionists have the same data, we have the same information, but we ascribe design, intelligent design, from our creative, loving Father as the reason for that similarity, and evolutionists don't. Okay, so it's when they say the science proves it, no, we have the same evidence. It's just their beliefs are different than our beliefs, and that's what evolution is.
And I would think genome sequencing would confirm a lot of that. You know, the technology we have today, that this gene didn't evolve from that gene.
A lot of what Darwin thought, he didn't have genetics back then. Mendel, if you remember your high school biology there, hadn't done his work with genetics yet. Mendel, by the way, another Christian, and that would cause Darwin some problems if he were alive today. Got about, what, 5 minutes? Any other questions, things we'd like to talk about?
I have one little one. So it would be fair if it comes up in a conversation, because it came up before about the dinosaurs being here millions of years ago. So it'd be fair to say, as a Christian, that anything dated older than 6,000 years is probably inaccurately dated.
I would argue that it is.
That would be my argument.
I would argue that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time. And we have artwork done by humans that show dinosaurs, which, how would they know what a Triceratops looked like if they were extinct 160 million years ago? But we do, we have those.
And speaking of that genome sequencing, that, you know, I watch a lot of these shows, and who was the guy from Creation Truth, Matt? So mitochondrial DNA, where human DNA can be traced back to 3 women, have you heard that? Okay.
Yeah.
And how many women were on the ark? 3. So he said, I'm not gonna hang my hat on that, but what the genome sequencing is, we're all descended from 3 women. All of our genome,
Modern man would be.
modern man.
Right.
Well, yeah,
Go, the 3 got from 1, and then
right.
but once he flooded it out, then
When he
there's
flooded-
3
there-
to start.
There were 3 women left,
Right.
so
It's just a coincidence, Pat.
just coincidence. Yeah. Well, you know, you don't hear that story very much, and of course, we've all talked about the secular world. That's not gonna be printed, and I wish I could find the, I guess I haven't looked very well, that white paper, or whatever you wanna call it, you know, that study, where the DNA can now be traced back to 3 women. I guess you can only do it, I don't know why you can only do it through the females, but, probably the, I don't know, double X chromosomes, those sorts of things. I don't know.
Completely different topic. What about global warming?
It's a dying universe. And are we creating some of it?
One day that the world's just gonna implode upon itself.
Well, they thought in the 70s that things were getting colder and colder and colder. If you lived in Indiana, it was. But then, if you're anybody around here in 78, 79, woo!
It was a bit.
Since the 1800s, it's only come up 2 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right. And then they even admit that this, like the Paris Accords, that if they do all of this thing, they can knock it down 1/2 degree.
But what do we do with the? Let's transition quickly to asking for a Christian friend who's caught up in global warming. At any minute, the world could implode, and this is another selfless plug into the end times thing Dan and I want to do. How does that mesh for a Christian?
Well, I think my thoughts on it, and it's still hard for me to wrap my hands around it, but if the earth is 6,000 years old, as we know it, is this cyclical? You know, what is this cycle? Is this something that occurred 5,000 years ago, and you have the cyclical ups and downs of temperatures? and where are we in the cycle, you know? How far back do we have data that says, this is, you know, what are we basing that on? This is how far back we have, and here's the temperature increase, okay, but what was it 500 years before that? Where are we?
It's a great point, especially if you're a scientist, secular scientist who believes the Earth's 4 billion years old, and you're basing your data off of a slice that's 100 years at 4 billion?
Right.
Yeah.
Now, is it potentially an issue? It's gone up 2 degrees, which, you know, there are places in the world that are flooding, like in Sudan and places like that, because the water table is coming up. But did that occur 500 years ago, 600 years ago too, you know?
But then you have the Netherlands that's what, 15 feet below sea level, and they have an airport and an entire town that's, and they border. It's kind of interesting.
Do we accept there was an ice age? Because that was 40,000 years ago, right? Glaciers were supposedly clear to here. Now it's dated 40,000 years ago. What, you know, if that happened, well, it wasn't 40,000 years ago. It was between 0 and 6,000. So look how quickly the Earth eats.
Watch the Is Genesis History thing. I think you guys
Right.
will enjoy it. It's a really cool.
But there's been, what, I can't remember, 5 or 7 glacial periods, so it wasn't just one.
Right,
Well, according to.
So,
right. That's true too. But yeah.
but, we can see we affect the environment. Now, whether we're on a long-term, cycle that we're talking about, but we can, human beings, affect the climate drastically. When we settled this nation, you know, we were going out and conquer generally speaking, everything east of the Mississippi was woodland, and everything west of the Mississippi was, prairie grass. Okay, look what we've done to the woods on woodland on this side of the Mississippi, and look what we've done. Now it's not prairie grasses, it's wheat, generally speaking. And when we first were conquering this continent, we went in there and plowed all those prairie grasses. Remember the Dust Bowl days? That was our fault. So we can, now, you know, the Mississippi River Valley itself is a good place to farm. But now when you get big rains, it floods frequently because we drain approximately the northern third of Indiana used to be swamps. The government subsidized draining those swamps, and now we raise 200 bushel corn. If you're gonna set things right, what would you do? Bring the swamps back for temporary storage so it wouldn't flood the Mississippi River Valley? Who do you cater to?
But can we do so much damage that all of a sudden the Earth just ceases to exist?
We can have a significant effect. No, I don't know about that. But we can have a significant effect. I mean, look how much 100% runoff comes from our rooftops, our driveways, and our highways. That didn't used to be. Now it quickly gets down to the Mississippi and ultimately the ocean. So we can significantly affect our living environment. Now, whether or not we are in the process of creating our end, I can't tell you that.
Oh, but you can actually. Because there's nothing that humans can do to destroy the Earth.
It's God's plan.
God is the creator and the sustainer of all things, and he says that he will make it all new. He never says that we ourselves can, if he didn't intervene, it says we would destroy it, but we can't. He won't allow it. So this whole, my only quick point on that was, because I have people who are diehard environmentalists and they're Christians, and this whole thing that if I start my truck up one more time, like that, this whole thing could go. Well, that doesn't mesh with your faith, because God says that can't happen. He'll make all things new. We're not just going to all of a sudden cease to exist. How does that work for this? It doesn't add up. Not that we don't. Certainly, things that we do and how we act, we should be responsible for what God has graciously given us in this world, and take steps to ensure that we care for it.
Be good stewards.
Yes, but we cannot destroy it to the point of, I suppose we can, but he won't allow it. He says he won't allow it, so.
Well, of course, we're discussing or trying to identify the end, but we are in the process of affecting it.
Well, we're doing that just by being born,
Yeah.
because there's an exponential amount of people being born, that the world is so much more populated
Yeah.
now than it was.
Yeah, close to 8 billion now, there's.
And keep in mind too, life expectancy is going up.
Right.
Well,
There's a lot of factors here that don't, it's just a discussion that we'll have to continue another time.
Well, you said about the global, I know we gotta leave, you said about the global warming and the thing I've been reading about lately, and you probably have seen it already, is they're doing some digs now because they can, because the Euphrates is drying up in places.
Right.
Now, they'll give you the stories that global warming, but they won't tell you Turkey, where the Euphrates starts, has 3 dams, and them in Syria are kinda at odds right now, so they're cutting the water off.
And they're irrigating,
Yes.
So,
diverting.
Any more, anybody have any prayer requests or praises? Still keeping the ones from last week in mind.
I praise that we have this class. More than just 2 more times. God,
I can do this class every day if we want.
Yes.
okay, I'm gonna hold you to it.
But you gotta read my email first.
Yeah, well, I get it.
All right, I'll close this. Father, man, we just thank you so much. What an unbelievable creation, Lord, that you've allowed us to share in and partake in, and you've created us as intelligent beings, Lord. And I just pray that as we converse with our coworkers or friends or random people at McDonald's or at a gas station, Lord, that we would be open to conversation, that we would be living our life, Lord, as Peter says, in such a way that people would ask us why we have the hope that we have, and that we can share with them and talk, and that more people, Lord, is the longer you allow, the more people can come to you. And I just pray for that, and I pray for this group of people. I pray for this church, Lord, that you would continue to help us to just to dig in and come nearer to you, Lord, and you'll come nearer to us as you promised, and that we can do things in this town and county and state that can't be done without you. And I love you, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and we thank you for your son. We pray for all those prayer requests, Lord, that are unnamed, unmentioned, the praises. We ask that you would comfort and be with all those, Lord, and whatever's going on. I pray that you would be with us, and we can come together next week and talk about evil. And I love you so much. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.